And please. First up is Rosie, fourth year art history minor and computer science major from Redwood City, California. She began engagement with this work in a class taught by Professor Christina Neilson. She hopes to continue to study art history and find ways to incorporate both of her fields of study into her future endeavors. Please join me in welcoming Rosie, who will present on analyzing the use of Trompe in A Young Rabbit and Partridge Hung by the Feet, which is on view in the back of this gallery, and you can view it after the talk.
I first studied this work, A Young Rabbit and Partridge Hung by the Feet by Jean-Baptiste Audry for Christina Neilson's Approaches to Western Art class. To start, we will be discussing Jean-Baptiste Audry's A Young Rabbit and Partridge Hung by the Feet, which is pictured here. I claim that this is a self-referential work of art. It attempts to capture reality, but also in some ways to transcend reality. This is accomplished in a way that reflects what was at the time an emerging thought about the natural world and the nature of human vision. First, we're going to cover a brief background of the artist. Then we're going to look at some of the more formal aspects of the painting. Next, there's going to be a comparison to a few similar works, and finally, a brief discussion of how this work connects to important ideas of the time. I promise I'm going to define what trompe is in just a little bit. Not quite yet, though. We're going to get there. Before we get started looking at the work, I'm going to give a little bit of background on the artist. And the work in question, as was already mentioned, is on view just right back there. And I would invite you to take a look at the end of Tuesday Tea. This work is an oil painting which depicts a rabbit and a partridge hanging face down from a hook in the wall. Their bodies press tightly against each other and the wall. They cast subtle shadows on each other and also the wall. The partridge's chest and belly face the viewer, while the rabbit's belly is pressed against the partridge's left side. This work was painted by Jean-Baptiste Audry in 1751 and was displayed at the Paris Salon. Audry was a successful French painter working during the early to mid 18th century, and he created many paintings for wealthy patrons and members of the nobility, including King Louis XV. Many of his works are focused on animals. He often painted directly from dead animal models, had access to a wealth of paintings held in Paris, and at points in his career had access to the royal menagerie, royal pets, and observed royal hunts. He also became a professor and developed many ideas about method and technique in painting. Now, I find this work very interesting because looking at it, it seems very naturalistic, very close to life. And in fact, the partridge in this painting is very easily identifiable as specifically a gray partridge, and actually specifically a male gray partridge. You can see here that I have some photographs of what these birds actually look like. When we compare what has been depicted with their real-life counterparts, we can see that the artist has very closely captured proportions, texture, colors, and even the size of the actual animals. So you can't really tell here, but the actual painting has the animals very close to what the size would actually be. Notably, this is achieved in a way where it's not really possible to see many signs of the artist's involvement or hand directly. So there are no visible brush strokes in the work, for example. This work can be considered a trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil is a genre of art where the aim is essentially to trick you into thinking that what you are viewing within a work is actually real. In this case, the trick is to make it look like the animals are actually hanging on the wall. And we can definitely see this here. This is a highly naturalistic style of painting. And combined with the composition, it seems to heavily suggest that the animals are real and exist within the viewer's space. The animals are constructed in a way that makes them feel very present. So the three-dimensionality of their forms is really emphasized. There's a shape that hints at underlying anatomy, so you can really see the muscles of the animals, and the way that their bodies are interacting with each other physically and also with the wall, and how they cast shadows really emphasizes their three-dimensional form. If we think about the position of the animals, they're depicted in the work in a way where they are actually breaking through the picture plane, the front of the canvas, and into the viewer's space. This is especially true of the partridge's right leg, which is sticking out at an angle. And if we were to imagine the partridge and the rabbit as being 3D objects on the wall, the leg would be poking out right at us. This painting was likely intended to be displayed by hanging on a wall. And while the subjects in the painting are also hanging on a wall, so this removes the degree of separation between the viewer and the painted objects. It makes them seem more believable that the animals could actually be hanging where the painting is. The work also has some very interesting connections to what was happening at the time more generally. Audrey was working throughout the Enlightenment, and we can clearly identify some aspects of this reflected in this work. The Enlightenment was a period in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries when people were developing new frameworks for thought, which encompassed many spheres of life. This included the development of new political, philosophical, artistic, and scientific thought. As a part of the broader movement of the Enlightenment, intellectuals developed new ideas specifically about the nature of vision and perception, and the importance of observation was beginning to play a larger role in scientific inquiry. This interest in vision is reflected in the development and popularization of the microscope within the aristocracy, who was notably also who would have been the intended audience for a painting like this. We know that Audrey's audience was wealthy aristocrats and nobles. This is generally who he painted for, and there are aspects of this work in particular that suggest that this is also his audience here. Hunting as a sport was a popular pastime for the wealthy, so the subject would have been appealing, as these are animals that would have been hunted for sport. This painting also has a visual appeal that connects deeply to the ideas about vision that these same people were interested in. Vision was seen as being an extremely important way of sensing and understanding the world, but it was also understood to be potentially unreliable or incomplete way to perceive reality. This unreliability is something that is also reflected in the painting. At first, it might seem real, but as we inspect the work more, it becomes clear that this is a painting. It's not actually real. The forms are naturalistic, but they're also very idealized in a few different ways. The animals themselves are very perfect looking for being dead. They look very clean, they look very healthy, and there is no sign of injury whatsoever. This stands out especially because some similar works with displayed game animals contain more signs that the animals are actually dead. For example, this still life with Dead Game by William Van Elst shows the animals displayed, the animals displayed as a lot more dead looking. You can actually see that there is blood on the faces of the animals. You can see blood on the rabbit's nose and on the chicken, and also a fly on the chicken. The color of the animals is also especially vibrant. Notice that the wings of the partridge are very pearly color. The orange of the head is very saturated, and the overall color is a lot more rich compared to what the actual bird generally looks like, which seems maybe a little bit more muted. This matches what we know about what Audrey thought about color specifically. He considered color to be incredibly important and a key component in creating illusion. The proper use of color played a large role in capturing what he termed the true nature of what was painted. Another thing to pay attention to is the background. There is no sense of place within this painting. Many similar works do provide more of a sense of place. For example, this work by Jan Wienix, gaming and hunting items arranged on a windowsill, we can see everything is positioned and framed by an alcove here or a window. And it's also, all the objects are resting on the shelf or windowsill that really gives them a lot more of a sense of place and a specific location versus the painting we're looking at, which has practically no details on the wall at all, which would hint at any particular place. In fact, something that might not be apparent just by looking at it today is that the bright color of the background would contrast with what might be the usual location of display. Generally, locations such as palaces where something like this might be displayed would have had darker colored walls. A very brief aside, the Allen has a different work by Jan Wienix on display, this one here, and I would encourage you to also take a look. Another thing to notice about this work is that in the lower right corner, you can see the artist's signature. Even though Audrey goes to great lengths in the painting itself to hide his involvement by doing things like hiding his brushstrokes, he makes it quite clear that in fact an artist did make this work because he signs it. Taking all of this combined, the bright colors, the details of the painting, the bright color of the wall, this all really breaks the illusion that the animals are actually present or real. These ideas about the nature of reality and human vision seem to be reflected in this work. At first, the work seems quite convincing, but ultimately our attention is drawn to the deception. The viewer's eyes and interpretations of their own vision are ultimately what activate the painting and cause the illusion of reality. Thank you so much.
Next is Charlotte Sturm. Charlotte is a fourth-year studio art major from Heartland, Vermont. Her research began 2 years ago in Christina Neilson's course, Approaches to Western Art. After graduating, Charlotte plans on moving to London while she figures out her next steps. Please join me in welcoming Charlotte, who will be presenting on the complicity of the viewer in David Drebin's Apollo, which can be seen here after the talks.
The piece I ended up choosing for this project was a color photograph by David Drebin entitled Apollo. I was drawn to this piece not because I found it particularly aesthetically pleasing, but because it brought up many questions for me. Revisiting this artwork has been incredibly rewarding, seeing that my interpretation of the work has developed since I first encountered the photograph 2 years ago. My main topic of research was David Drebin's use of the femme fatale narrative in his work. I initially felt that the work used this Hollywood trope to diminish the female experience of being scrutinized on the street and to normalize the potential male assailant in the background. In doing so, Drebin renders the viewer as an inactive bystander. The double meaning of the title of the piece, which I will discuss later, further objectifies the woman, casting her in the role of passive victim. In this talk, I will share an analysis of the photograph and discuss how further research, in tandem with my conversation with Allen's curator of modern and contemporary art, has deepened my interpretation of the piece and left me with further questions surrounding the artist's work at large. As you can see here in the photograph, a man, woman, and child stand in sharp focus on a blurry, color-saturated city street. The woman has big brown eyes, and she's wearing a green skirt and a green long-sleeve top that exposes her cleavage and stomach. The man stands behind the woman and child. He's positioned behind the two, with his head turned over his right shoulder to look at them. The woman's eyes are wide, her mouth is turned downward, and her eyebrows are drawn, giving her a look of fear as she looks out to the left-hand side of the frame. Their location on the city street, the woman's concerned expression, and the man's foreboding presence over the woman's shoulder conveys to the viewer that the woman has perceived this man behind her as a threat. This allusion to danger isn't merely an image for the viewer to witness, but rather an event that the viewer is complicit in. The woman's feet, had they been extended beyond the frame, would be planted right in front of the viewer, simultaneously implicating the onlooker in the discomfort visible on the woman's face and positioning us as witness to the potentially harmful situation unfolding. Drebin invokes a sense of collusion between the man and viewer, given that they are both watching the woman in the forefront of the piece. In my initial analysis of the work, I interpreted this connection between the viewer and the man as a reference to the femme fatale narrative in Hollywood, where the man on the street is a relatable, sympathetic character, while Drebin casts the woman as the sexually alluring femme fatale. The femme fatale narrative appeared in Hollywood films in the 1940s and 1950s, where a new category of woman emerged, categorized by her alluring sexuality in addition to her morally depraved character. This prototype became popular in film noir in the 1940s when women's place in society started to shift as a result of World War II. This character in Hollywood reflected men's insecurities about the emergence of women in the workforce and tried to put those insecurities to rest by depicting these sexually liberated women as criminals in their seductive qualities. Upon revisiting the paper, I began asking more questions about the characters in the scene and the intent of Drebin's work in general. I no longer believed the woman to be one of Drebin's femme fatales due to the presence of the child. Her role as mother in the photograph subverts her role as sexually alluring female and rather asserts her identity as a mother, casting her in a sympathetic light. That being said, the work still relies on the spectacle of the female subject within the throes of a dangerous situation, while profiling the man as a potential perpetrator of sexual violence. The photograph is set in Harlem, an epicenter of Black culture. Drebin's position as a white photographer portraying people of color in a potentially dangerous situation within the context of a historically Black neighborhood begs the question of whether or not Drebin is commenting on these harmful depictions or profiting off of them. While I will mostly be discussing the ways in which Drebin portrays the woman in the piece, it is important to note the context in which Drebin characterizes a person of color as a threat and how this perpetuates racial stereotypes. I want to briefly mention that the title of the piece, Apollo, evokes, perhaps unintentionally, the Greek myth of Apollo and Daphne. Most artistic works about Apollo are depictions of this myth where Apollo tries to rape Daphne and she turns into a tree. Here, the man appears in the role of Apollo as a threat to the ostensibly passive woman. Given this art historical context, Drebin objectifies the woman by portraying her as a character who, as a result of Apollo's attempted assault, becomes an object. David Drebin's Apollo is an outlier within his body of work, which often portrays isolated women in dramatic urban environments. While Apollo deviates from elements of Drebin's other work, the sentiment of his photographs is generally concurrent. In a 2024 interview with Fine Art Shippers magazine, Drebin talks about his artistic practice, stating, "Sometimes the worst experiences make the best photographs." The romanticization of female misfortune is a recurring theme in Drebin's work. High Maintenance is a 2012 photograph from his series Beautiful Disasters. A woman precariously perches on a ladder, half naked, wearing heels. Her face is covered by her hair as she covers her bare breasts with her left arm. To the left side of the photograph, a cityscape is lit up under a night sky. Apart from the fact that this situation feels a bit unwarranted, by casting the woman in this sexualized light, Drebin alludes to her promiscuity while juxtaposing her with the danger she is potentially falling into. This piece contains similarities to many of Drebin's works, including Apollo, in the sense that both pieces position the female subject in a potentially dangerous situation, where the onlooker is reduced to a passive bystander. In 2023, when I was researching David Drebin, I found that he dedicated a portion of his website to the femme fatale theme. Additionally, Drebin references this enigmatic, beautiful subject in his book Beautiful Disasters. Drebin depicts these women as femme fatales in his work, describing them as fascinating and tortured, wild and genius, crazy and passionate, destructive and dangerous. Drebin casts many of his female subjects into this role, and in doing so, he perpetuates harmful stereotypes. My initial analysis of the piece grouped Apollo in with his other works, that exploits the femme fatale narrative, but upon further examination of the piece, I found that the image places a woman in the role of passive victim rather than villainized seductress. What drew me to this piece was the gender politics at play in the image. But as I learned more about the artist's own identity and position as straight white man profiting off depictions of female vulnerability, my interpretation of the work further changed. The image is a strong depiction of the all too familiar experience of being catcalled or sexually threatened in public. And yet, it is unclear whether the photograph is bringing attention to this negative experience by highlighting the problem or if it is aestheticizing it. At the same time, I began to wonder if it is appropriate for an artist to represent an issue so far outside of their own lived experience. By turning something dangerous and sexist into a beautiful image that the artist can sell for profit, isn't he aestheticizing the suffering of women? What are the conditions that make it ethical for an artist to depict, aestheticize, and profit off harms to which they have no personal experience? This well-known distracted boyfriend meme, whose composition is strikingly similar to Drebin's Apollo, is a good cultural example of these questions surrounding identity and artistic license. In 2015, this image was uploaded to Shutterstock with the caption, "Disloyal man walking with his girlfriend and looking amazed at another seductive girl." This idea of a female seductress distracting a man on the street mimics the dynamics at play in Apollo. This connection between the two photographs may be contained within different contexts, but the disregard of the female experience are apparent in these compositionally similar images. The trivialization of the female experience is a recurring theme in both art and our visual culture more broadly, which makes me return to my question of who can represent situations they have been uninvolved in, and how can art bring attention to these narratives without doing further harm? Here, you'll see an example of this meme at play. A meme is an interesting foil to Drebin's photograph because anyone can repost it and add text to the image as they see fit. While there is an original author of the image, the way in which it circulates on the internet and social media feeds divorces the image from the artist's original intent. Drebin's image initially captured my attention because it too depicts a scenario that plays into themes of gender and power. This meme exemplifies the way in which we are drawn to these dynamics, whether within the context of a museum or on our Instagram feeds. This brings me back to my previous questions surrounding the identity of the artist. Perhaps what is problematic is not that a straight white man produced and sold an image that encompasses harmful cliches about women and people of color, but rather that he's not critical of what it means to circulate and look at such an image. I hope that my research and my talk today adds to the context of this photograph so that we are not merely looking at a curated piece of art, but rather thinking critically about the implications of the image before us. Thank you.